Have you ever stood by the shore and looked out at the sea? It's easy to see it as just a vast, empty blue, a beautiful nothingness. But I want you to know, that is an illusion. The ocean is not empty. It is the world's greatest library. It is a museum of memory, holding stories in its silent, sunken halls. Stories of love, of loss, of courage, and of secrets. This is one of those stories. A story that was almost lost forever. Our story begins not in the deep, but in the light. In a bustling shipyard in 1912, the air was thick with the smell of salt and fresh-cut timber. And there she was, the SS Atlantia, a magnificent ocean liner, a titan of her age. Her hull was a sleek, black fortress, and her funnels stood like proud sentinels, promising power and speed. To the people who built her, she was a masterpiece. To the passengers who booked their passage, she was a promise of a new life across the Atlantic. But to one man, her designer, Alistair Finch, she was something more. She was his legacy. He had poured his soul into her, designing her with a revolutionary and, he believed, unsinkable hull. He saw her not just as a ship, but as a testament to human ingenuity, a declaration of our victory over the wild, untamable sea. The day of her maiden voyage was a carnival. Streamers fluttered in the air, a brass band played a jaunty tune, and the docks were a chaos of joyful tears and shouted farewells. On board, amongst the throng, was a young woman named Eleanor. She held a single, worn suitcase and a ticket to America, where she was to be a governess. Tucked inside her suitcase, wrapped in oilcloth, was a journal. On its first page, she had written, "The beginning of everything." She stood at the railing, her face turned towards the horizon, her heart a mixture of terror and thrilling hope. She watched Alistair Finch himself walking the deck, a proud, almost stern figure, nodding with satisfaction as his creation came to life. He passed her by, his eyes glancing at the sea, never at the people who trusted their lives to his genius. In that moment, two destinies were on that ship: the man who believed he had conquered the ocean, and the woman who was just beginning to understand its power. The first 2 days were a dream. The Atlantia cut through the water like a knife through silk. The passengers dined and danced. They marveled at the ship's opulence, its electric lights, its sheer immensity. It felt less like being on the sea, and more like a moving, floating palace. Alistair Finch would walk the decks at night, listening to the hum of the engines, the sound of his own triumph. He felt invincible. They all did. But the ocean has a way of reminding you of the truth. It has a patience that dwarfs our own. It waits. On the third night, the weather changed. The sky, which had been a blanket of stars, became a void. The wind, once a gentle breeze, began to howl like a forgotten ghost. The sea, so calm and compliant, awoke. It rose in great, black mountains, and the Atlantia, for all her supposed invincibility, began to feel very, very small. Alistair was in the bridge, his face lit by the storm lanterns, his calculations and blueprints suddenly feeling like children's drawings. He shouted orders, but his voice was swallowed by the roar of the wind. The ship groaned, a deep, agonizing sound of metal being tested beyond its limits. It was a sound he had never designed for. It was the sound of reality. Below deck, Eleanor held onto her bunk, her knuckles white. The world was tilting, crashing, chaos. Water sloshed in the corridors. The screams of the passengers were punctuated by the shattering of fine china and the terrible, final booms of shifting cargo. In the darkness, she fumbled for her journal. She couldn't see to write, but she held it to her chest, a tiny, paper-thin shield against the oblivion that was coming. She thought not of the future she was losing, but of the family she was leaving behind. Her story, she thought, would end here, unread. And then, the unthinkable. A crack, louder than any thunder. The ship shuddered. A death rattle. Alistair knew that sound. It was the sound of his legacy breaking in two. The revolutionary hull had failed. The cold Atlantic poured in, relentless, impartial. It did not care about his pride. It did not care about Eleanor's dreams. In less than an hour, the grand SS Atlantia, the unsinkable titan, was gone. She slipped beneath the waves, taking Alistair, Eleanor, and over 1,000 souls with her. The storm raged on, and then, as if nothing had happened, it passed. The sea became calm once more. A silent, blue grave. For a century, the story of the Atlantia became a legend, a cautionary tale whispered in maritime schools. A story of hubris, a story of a ship that challenged the sea and lost. She was the forgotten story, a ghost on a chart. Until now, our story jumps to the present day, to a different kind of ship, a small research vessel floating over the very spot where the Atlantia was lost. On board is Dr. Aris Thorne, a marine archaeologist. For her, the Atlantia was an obsession, not because of its fame, but because of the mystery. Why did it sink so fast? The official inquiries blamed the storm, but the models never quite added up. Aris believed the sea was keeping a secret. She and her team sent down remotely operated vehicles, little electronic eyes into the darkness. The feed came back on a bank of monitors, showing the world of eternal night. And then, they found her. The wreck of the SS Atlantia was not a neat, resting giant. It was a debris field, a skeleton picked clean by time and pressure. But it was there. The cameras glided over a ghostly landscape, a rusted anchor, a porthole, its glass long gone, like a hollow eye socket. Schools of fish, now the ship's only passengers, flitted through the ruins. Aris guided the raft deeper, towards the fractured hull. This was the moment of truth. The answer to a 100-year-old question. The camera's lights scanned the steel plates. And then, they saw it. Not a jagged tear from an iceberg, not a catastrophic explosion. It was a line. A perfect, straight line of rivets that had sheared clean off. A structural failure, a design flaw. Alistair Finch's pride had literally been the crack in his armor. The sea hadn't broken his ship, his own design had. Aris felt a profound sadness, not triumph. She had solved the mystery, but it felt like uncovering a grave. She was about to call it a day when her pilot said, "Aris, look, there's something in that crevice. It doesn't look like metal." The robotic arm, with delicate precision, reached into a narrow space between a bent bulkhead and the seafloor. It emerged, holding something. It was a box. A metal lockbox, encrusted in a century of rust and barnacles. It was a miracle it had survived. With hearts pounding, they brought it to the surface. Inside, protected by the metal and the unique, oxygen-poor environment of the silt, was a journal. Eleanor's journal. The oilcloth had done its job. The pages were water-stained and fragile, but the writing, the elegant, looping script, was still legible. Aris, wearing white gloves, turned the pages under the lab lights on her ship. She did not read about the grand design of the ship or the panic of the sinking. She read Eleanor's story, the hopes she had for America, her description of a young boy she saw on deck, sharing his sweets with his sister, her memory of her mother's face, waving goodbye. The last entry was not finished. It was a single sentence, written as the ship began its final tilt. It read, "I am afraid, but I have loved, and I have been loved, and perhaps that is the only legacy that the sea cannot swallow." In that moment, the story of the Atlantia transformed. It was no longer just a story about a shipwreck. It was no longer just a lesson about hubris. It was a story about two legacies. One was Alistair Finch's, a legacy of steel and ambition, which now lay broken and scattered on the ocean floor, a monument to a flaw. The other was Eleanor's, a legacy of love and memory, written in simple ink on simple paper. And which one had truly endured? Which one had traveled through a century of darkness to deliver its message? The sea had not kept the secret of the flawed metal, it had kept the secret of the unbreakable human heart. So, when you next look out at the sea, remember, the waves hide more than sunken treasure. They hold our stories, they hold our follies and our courage. The ocean is the great equalizer. Yes, it can bring down the mighty and the humble alike, but it is also the great preserver. It reminds us that what we build to impress the world may turn to rust, but what we build in our hearts, the love we share, the kindness we show, the hope we carry that is unsinkable. That is the forgotten story of the sea, a story written not in water, but in the indelible ink of the human spirit, and it is waiting, always, to be remembered.